Some of these cases sat cold for decades, victims forgotten, families left waiting, killers walking free in plain sight. Then one DNA match, one metadata slip, one lie told to a narcissist, and everything unraveled. We're breaking down 5 of the most notorious cold cases that were finally cracked, starting with a killer who turned the bodies of 48 women into bargaining chips to save his own life. Green River Killer Gary Ridgway, solved 2001. Gary Ridgway murdered 48 women and then used their bodies as a bargaining chip to save his own life. Let that sink in for a second. The Green River killings started in July 1982 when the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was pulled from the Green River near Seattle, Washington. Within a month, 4 more women turned up along the same stretch of riverbank. Investigators knew almost immediately they were dealing with a serial killer. But knowing you have a problem and actually solving it are 2 very different things, and this particular problem would take nearly 2 decades to crack. Here's the thing about the Green River case that makes it so infuriating. Most of Ridgway's victims were sex workers or women living on the margins near Pacific Highway South. They were vulnerable, they were transient. And because of that, the case was treated with less urgency than it deserved for years. Women kept disappearing, bodies kept turning up in wooded areas and near waterways around King County, and the investigation just dragged. Not because detectives didn't care, but because the system around them had already decided these victims didn't warrant the same resources as someone's missing suburban daughter. Which is, not ideal. Ridgway was actually on the radar early. He'd been interviewed, even had a DNA sample taken back in the 1980s, but the technology to do anything useful with that sample simply didn't exist yet. So investigators did something genuinely smart. They preserved the biological evidence. They held on to it, betting that one day science would catch up to their suspicions. And in 2001, it did. King County authorities re-examined the preserved evidence using improved DNA typing methods that hadn't been available during the original investigation. The results matched Gary Leon Ridgway, a truck painter living in the Seattle area who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 20 years. He was arrested in November of 2001, initially charged with 4 murders, and then the floodgates opened. By 2003, prosecutors had added more victims to the charges, and Ridgway entered into one of the most controversial plea agreements in American criminal history. He pled guilty to 48 murders committed between 1982 and 1998. 48. Then, in 2011, he added a 49th, Rebecca Marrero, in a Kent, Washington courtroom. That number alone makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history, but the number isn't even the most disturbing part. The deal was this. Ridgway would receive life in prison without parole instead of the death penalty. In exchange, he would help investigators locate the remains of victims whose bodies had never been found. He would walk detectives through remote disposal sites, point out unmarked graves in the woods, and provide details that only the killer could know. Essentially, he commodified his victims twice, once when he murdered them, and again when he traded the locations of their bodies like currency to keep himself alive. Hey, I know where that 12 more of them are buried. That's gotta be worth something, right? And prosecutors agreed. Because for the families who had spent years, sometimes decades, not knowing where their daughters, sisters, and mothers were, the recovery of remains meant something. It meant funerals, it meant answers. It meant an end to the worst kind of uncertainty. So the state made a deal with a man who had killed 48 people, and he walked away from the death penalty. The Death Penalty Information Center has pointed to Ridgway's case as a textbook example of arbitrariness in capital punishment. At the time of his sentencing, roughly 3,500 people sat on death row across the country, many convicted of a single homicide. Ridgway admitted to 48 and got life. The math doesn't math, but the logic, uncomfortable as it is, made a certain grim kind of sense. Dead bodies in unmarked graves don't find themselves. Whether you think that deal was justified or morally bankrupt probably depends on whether you prioritize punishment or closure. There's no clean answer. A man who strangled 48 women over 16 years is alive today because he remembered where he put them. Not all stories have a satisfying moral. Sometimes they're just ugly from beginning to end. But if you think one killer gaming the system is disturbing, wait until you hear about the guy who literally asked the police if they could trace a floppy disk, got told no, and then sent one anyway. BTK killer Dennis Rader, solved 2005. Dennis Rader murdered at least 10 people in Wichita, Kansas between 1974 and 1991, and nobody had a clue who he was. Not for 30 years, he gave himself the name BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, because apparently committing serial murder wasn't enough. He needed branding. His first known victims were 4 members of the Otero family in January 1974. 4 people, including 2 children, killed during a home invasion. And after that, Rader didn't stop. He kept killing at irregular intervals across the next 17 years, targeting people in their own homes, binding them, suffocating them. Each murder was what he called a project. He planned them out like someone planning a kitchen renovation. Except the end result was murder, but here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Between murders, Dennis Rader was the most boring man alive. Married, kids, worked in municipal compliance, which is literally the job of telling people their fence is 2 inches too tall. He was president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church in Park City. The kind of guy who'd report you for an overgrown lawn on a Tuesday and then smile at you during Sunday service. Meanwhile, he was taunting police and media with letters containing unpublished crime scene details that only the actual killer could know. He'd describe what he did, threaten future attacks, and demand recognition. Then he'd go home, eat dinner with his family, and act like everything was completely normal. For decades. After 1991, the murders stopped, and so did the letters. BTK just vanished. The case went cold. Wichita moved on. The investigation sat in a filing cabinet gathering dust for over a decade. Then, in 2004, Rader made the single dumbest decision of his entire life. He came back, he started sending new letters to local media, reasserting the BTK identity like a retired musician announcing a comeback tour nobody asked for. And during this victory lap, he asked police whether a floppy disk could be traced back to its sender. The cops said no, it would be totally safe, they were lying, obviously. But Rader believed them because the man who evaded capture for 30 years apparently had zero understanding of how computers work. He mailed in a floppy disk. On that disk was a single deleted file. Here's the thing about deleted files. They're not actually gone. The metadata was still there. And when a forensic examiner recovered it, the file showed it had last been saved by a user named Dennis on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church. Yeah, that's it. That's how they caught him. 30 years of terror, 10 murders, thousands of tips, and the whole thing ended because a serial killer didn't know what metadata was. Investigators found Dennis Rader, president of the church council, and within days had him under surveillance. When they searched his home, they found photographs, writings, and trophies from his victims. The ghost of Wichita had been the guy running the church bake sale the entire time. Once arrested, Rader confessed to all 10 murders in detail. He walked through each killing like he was giving a PowerPoint presentation describing how he stalked victims and carried out his projects. Everyone in that courtroom had to listen to this man narrate his own horror show with the emotional range of someone reading a grocery list. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole in 2005. Kansas didn't have the death penalty at the time, so this was the maximum available punishment. 10 life sentences stacked on top of each other, which is the legal system's way of saying we really, really mean it. The community reaction was pure disbelief. People who had sat next to this man in church pews for years genuinely could not process that he was BTK. The compliance officer who cited you for a code violation was the same person who murdered 10 people and wrote poems about it to the newspaper. That's a level of compartmentalization that borders on science fiction. And the ultimate irony is impossible to ignore. A man who successfully hid his identity for 3 decades was undone by his own narcissism. He didn't need to come back. The case was cold. Nobody was close to catching him. But he missed the attention. He missed being BTK. So he reached out, asked if a floppy disk was safe, got lied to, and handed police his name, his church, and his entire identity on a piece of plastic smaller than a phone screen, which is, not ideal. But if you think getting caught by your own floppy disk is embarrassing, wait until you hear how the Golden State Killer was identified by a relative's recreational DNA test. Golden State Killer Cheer Joseph D'Angelo, solved 2018. For over 40 years, investigators had the Golden State Killer's DNA sitting in evidence. They had biological proof of exactly who committed at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and hundreds of burglaries across California, and it meant absolutely nothing. Because his DNA wasn't in any law enforcement database, and if your profile isn't in the system, you don't exist. Here's the thing about Joseph James D'Angelo. He didn't just commit crimes. He committed crimes under so many different identities that nobody even realized it was one guy. In the early 1970s, he was the Visalia Ransacker, a prolific burglar breaking into homes and stealing personal items. Then he became the East Area Rapist, terrorizing Sacramento with home invasion, sexual assaults. Then he evolved again into the original Night Stalker, murdering couples in Southern California. 3 separate crime sprees, 3 separate task forces, all chasing the same man who was calmly driving between jurisdictions and switching up his methods like he was rotating playlists. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable. D'Angelo was a police officer. He served as a cop in Exeter and Auburn, California during the exact years he was committing some of these crimes. He understood how investigations worked, what officers looked for, how evidence was collected. The man was literally attending law enforcement briefings by day and breaking into homes by night, which is, not ideal. But the real story here isn't what D'Angelo did, it's how they finally caught him. For decades, investigators had viable crime scene DNA. They ran it through every criminal database available: CODIS, state databases, federal databases, zero matches. D'Angelo had never been convicted of a felony that required DNA submission. His profile simply didn't exist in the system. The evidence was screaming his name, and nobody could hear it. Then, in 2018, an investigator named Paul Holes and a team of analysts did something that had never been done in a major criminal case before. They uploaded the crime scene DNA to GEDmatch, a free open-source genealogy database. Not a law enforcement database. A website where regular people upload their 23andMe and Ancestry DNA results to find distant cousins. The kind of site your aunt uses to figure out if she's 4% Scandinavian. They didn't find D'Angelo's DNA on GEDmatch. They didn't need to. They found partial matches to his distant relatives, people who shared enough genetic markers to indicate they were on the same family tree. From there, investigators built genealogical charts, mapped out family branches, cross-referenced ages and locations. They narrowed the pool down to a handful of candidates who were the right age, lived in the right areas, and fit the behavioral profile. Joseph James D'Angelo rose to the top of that list, but you can't arrest someone based on their third cousin's spit kit. So investigators collected a discarded DNA sample from D'Angelo's trash outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. They tested it against the crime scene profiles. It matched, decisively. Across multiple crime scenes spanning over a decade. On April 24, 2018, officers arrested 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo at his home. The man who had been a ghost for 40 years was standing in his driveway in his bathrobe. In 2020, he pled guilty to 13 murders as part of a plea deal that took the death penalty off the table. Life in prison without parole. Case closed. But the implications? Those are still wide open, because here's what this case actually proved. You don't need a criminal's DNA in a database to find them. You just need a distant relative, a third cousin you've never met. Someone who bought a DNA kit on Black Friday because it seemed like a fun gift, swabbed their cheek, uploaded the results, and went back to watching television. That person just became a genetic informant without knowing it. Their recreational curiosity about whether they're related to Charlemagne just handed law enforcement a direct line to their entire extended family tree. The privacy debate that followed was immediate. Ethicists pointed out that nobody submits DNA to consumer services, thinking, I wonder if this will expose my second cousin to a murder investigation. And yet, that's exactly what happened. One relative's uploaded profile was enough to crack a 40-year cold case. The question became simple: where's the line? Some people celebrated it as the most important forensic breakthrough since DNA fingerprinting itself. Others called it a massive violation of genetic privacy. Both sides had a point. I don't know what to tell you. What nobody debates is the result. A former cop who spent 12 years raping and murdering people across California, who then spent another 32 years living quietly in suburban Sacramento like nothing happened, was finally identified because a distant relative wanted to learn about their ancestry. D'Angelo had beaten every traditional investigative method for 4 decades. He didn't beat a genealogy website, but if you think the Golden State Killer case sat unsolved for a long time, the next one involves a small town torn apart by a murder with evidence staring everyone right in the face. Delphi murders R. Richard Allen, solved 2222, convicted Timayu 24. A 14-year-old girl watched a stranger walk toward her on a bridge and decided to hit record on her phone. That single decision defined the next 7 years of one of America's most agonizing cold cases. On February 13, 2017, Abby Williams, 13, and Libby German, 14, were dropped off near the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana, for an afternoon hike. They never came home. Their bodies were found the following day in a wooded area near Deer Creek, just a short distance from the trail. And normally, that's where the evidence trail would go cold. 2 victims in a rural area, no witnesses, no cameras. Case goes nowhere for decades. But Libby German had her smartphone. Before she was killed, Libby managed to capture video footage of a man walking across the bridge toward them. Grainy, shaky, brief, but unmistakably a person. Jeans, a blue jacket, hands in his pockets, walking with purpose. Authorities also recovered audio from the phone, a male voice saying 3 words, "down the hill." That's it, 3 words, and a few seconds of video. Police released both to the public, hoping someone would recognize the man's voice, his gait, his build, anything. And here's where it gets genuinely maddening. You have a suspect on video. You have his voice. In the age of facial recognition, viral social media, and a nation of armchair detectives, surely someone identifies this guy within a week, right? 5 years. 0 arrests. The investigation churned through numerous persons of interest. Tips poured in by the thousands. Indiana State Police released composite sketches, updated those sketches, held press conferences, and made direct appeals to the killer on camera. None of it produced an arrest. The case just sat there, taunting everyone who looked at that bridge photo and thought I almost recognize him. Meanwhile, the internet did what the internet does. Online sleuthing communities descended on the case like it was a collaborative puzzle. Facebook groups, Reddit threads, YouTube channels, all dedicated to analyzing every single frame of Libby's video. People zoomed in on the suspect's jacket, debated whether he was carrying a weapon under his coat, measured the length of his stride, compared his posture to photos of local residents. Some of this was genuinely thoughtful analysis, a lot of it was not. Innocent people in Delphi found their names and faces plastered across true crime forums with zero evidence connecting them to anything. Locals who happened to be the wrong height or owned the wrong jacket got publicly accused by strangers on the internet who'd never set foot in Indiana, which is, not ideal. The breakthrough finally came in October 2022 when Richard Allen, a Delphi resident, was arrested and charged with the murders. Here's the part that makes your head spin. Allen had actually told investigators early in the case that he'd been on the Monon High Bridge Trail that day. He volunteered that information, but somehow his tip wasn't properly followed up on for years. His name sat in the case files while the entire country stared at that bridge video trying to figure out who the man was. The guy they were looking for had essentially raised his hand and said, "I was there," and then just went back to his life in the same small town where 2 girls were murdered. Investigators eventually linked Allen to the crime through a combination of physical evidence, witness statements, and that earlier admission of being on the trail. The specifics of the physical evidence became a major point of contention, particularly the ballistics. Prosecutors presented tool mark analysis suggesting that an unspent round found near the victims' bodies had been cycled through Allen's firearm. Not fired. Cycled. The defense pushed back hard on this, arguing that tool mark comparison on cartridge casings is inherently subjective, that different examiners can reach different conclusions looking at the same marks, and that the entire field lacks the kind of rigorous empirical validation you'd want when someone's life is on the line. That debate didn't save Allen. In November 2024, a jury convicted him on all counts: felony murder while attempting kidnapping of Abby Williams, felony murder while attempting kidnapping of Libby German, knowing murder of each victim. 4 counts total, guilty on every single one. On December 20th, 2024, the court sentenced Richard Allen to 130 years in prison. 65 years per murder served consecutively. During sentencing, the victims' families addressed the court, describing what the last 7 years had been like, living in the same town as the man who killed their children without knowing it. The Delphi case sits in a strange place. It's solved. A man was convicted and sentenced. But the ballistics controversy lingers, appeals are expected, and the online communities that spent years dissecting every pixel of Libby's video are now dissecting every piece of trial evidence with the same intensity. Some are satisfied, some aren't. And through all of it, the thing that sticks with you isn't the forensics or the legal arguments, it's the fact that a 14-year-old girl saw danger coming and had the presence of mind to press record, and that recording became the single most important piece of evidence in a case that took half a decade to crack. But if you think the Delphi case was frustrating to follow, wait until you hear about a killer who left bodies along a Long Island beach for over a decade while living as a completely ordinary architect. Gilgo Beach. Killer, Long Island, serial killer, Case Rex Hiraman, solved 20/23 of 2024. For over a decade, nobody knew who was burying women along Ocean Parkway. Starting in 2010, multiple sets of human remains were discovered near Gilgo Beach on Long Island, scattered across miles of scrubland beside a highway that thousands of people drove every single day. Many of the victims were sex workers, some couldn't even be identified, and the killer had zero name, zero face, zero leads that went anywhere. The media called him the Long Island serial killer, which sounds like a Netflix title because it basically became one. But for years, that's all anyone had, a nickname and a growing body count. The case just sat there, cold. Investigators cycled through theories, persons of interest came and went, and families lived in a permanent state of not knowing. The Gilgo Four, the first cluster of women found in close proximity, became the symbolic core of the investigation, but additional remains kept turning up along the same corridor. Some were partial, some were children. The whole thing felt less like a single crime and more like a burial ground that nobody could explain. Then, in 2023, they arrested an architect, Rex Heuermann, a man living in Massapequa Park, Long Island, commuting into Manhattan to design buildings. Professional, employed, blending into the most mundane version of suburban life imaginable. Investigators connected him through DNA analysis, cell tower data placing him in specific locations at specific times, and patterns in his digital communications. The guy was literally going to work, coming home, and existing as a completely unremarkable member of society while being linked to multiple murders spanning years, which is, not ideal. The BTK parallels are impossible to ignore. Dennis Rader was a church president and compliance officer. Heuermann was a licensed architect with a Manhattan practice. Both men built entire professional identities that functioned as perfect camouflage. The difference is that Rader got caught because he couldn't resist sending a floppy disk. Heuermann got caught because modern forensics don't care how normal you look. Cell towers remember where your phone was. DNA doesn't forget who touched what. In early 2026, Hoyerman agreed to plead guilty to the murders of 7 women: Megan Waterman, Melissa Barthelemy, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Castilla, and Karen Vergata. He also admitted responsibility for the death of Valerie Mack, bringing the total to 8 victims, 8 names, 8 lives. As part of the plea, he accepted life in prison without parole. No trial, no drawn-out courtroom drama, just a man standing in front of a judge and acknowledging what he'd done for years while the rest of the world assumed he was just some guy with a briefcase. But here's where this case separates itself from every other one we've covered today. It's still not fully resolved. Hoyerman's plea covered those victims, but other remains were found along that same stretch of Ocean Parkway, and not all of them have been conclusively linked to him. There are legitimate questions about whether he acted alone, and whether every set of remains discovered near Gilgo Beach belongs to the same investigation. The case is largely solved, but largely is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. And then there's the story of Peaches. For over a decade, one of the victims found near Gilgo Beach was known only as Jane Doe. Number 3, investigators called her Peaches because of a tattoo on her body. That was it. No name, no confirmed identity, just a nickname based on a piece of ink. Her child, a toddler found nearby, was equally anonymous. 2 human beings reduced to evidence markers in a case file. In April 2025, the Nassau County Police Department announced that they had finally identified her as Tanya Denise Jackson. The child was identified as 2-year-old Tatiana Marie Dykes. After more than a decade of being a Jane Doe, she got her name back. That identification didn't make headlines the way Hoyerman's arrest did, but it mattered more than most people will ever understand. Netflix's Gone Girls documentary shifted the media conversation around Gilgo Beach in an important way. For years, coverage had leaned into the serial killer mystique, the sensationalized "who is the Long Island serial killer" angle that treated the case like a puzzle, rather than a series of tragedies involving real women. The documentary pushed back against that, focusing on the victims as individuals with lives and families that existed long before they became entries in a homicide investigation. Here's the thing about the word solved: we use it like it means finished, case closed, book shut, move on. But Gilgo Beach proves that solved doesn't always mean complete. Multiple murders have a guilty plea attached to them. Other remains still raise questions. A woman spent over a decade without her name. Every case we've covered today followed the same basic arc. A monster hid in plain sight. Time passed, technology caught up, justice arrived late, but it arrived. And every single one, the resolution came with an asterisk. Ridgway's plea bargain traded execution for body locations. Rader's capture hinged on a deleted file he thought was gone. D'Angelo was identified through a cousin's recreational DNA test, and Hoyerman's guilty plea covers victims in a case that might involve more. Solved doesn't mean simple. It never has. Citizen, sometimes it just means we finally know enough to stop guessing and start grieving. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.